So, our presenter today is Leonette Boyarsky, and Leonette is actually a licensed clinical social worker and an adoptive mother. She lives in Pennsylvania, where she works full time at Madison Adoption Associates in program development and post permanency advocacy. Leonette has over 15 years working in the adoption field as an administrator and has provided a host of workshops nationally and regionally on various topics. So we're super excited to have you, Leonette. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tyler. So I'm very excited about doing this webinar today. This is my first webinar, so I'm used to talking to a live audience. So today we're going to talk about understanding the connection between adoption and trauma. I'm very excited to present this for two reasons. One, I want to make those in the audience aware of the post-adoption services that are available in the state of Pennsylvania for any adoptive family, whether they adopted internationally, domestically, through foster care, even if they adopted outside of the state of Pennsylvania and moved to Pennsylvania. So that's the first reason. The second reason is in providing the post-permanency services that our agency does, we're always looking for therapists who have an understanding of the connection between adoption and trauma and who are trauma informed. So there is a contact number at the end of the presentation, and I would ask if you are a therapist in the audience and you are interested in receiving referrals, from people who are doing the post-adoption work in the state of Pennsylvania, please contact me so I can connect you with those therapists with those affiliates who are doing that service. Okay, so let's begin. Today's presentation is going to talk a little bit about the state of adoption in Pennsylvania. We're going to cover grief and loss, which is a big part of adoption, as well as the new research in brain development, attachment, which is a key piece for adoptive families and children, how to help adoptive families, the importance of building resilience, considering secondary trauma, and then we'll finalize with that post-permanency services through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Here are my presentation sources. I encourage you to read these books, to Google these people, to look on YouTube. There's a lot of free information that's provided by these professionals. And I would say that there are some of the top professionals dealing with attachment, grief and loss, trauma, adoption, and will really guide you in learning more about what I'm talking about today. And this list is available on your handouts. So some bottom lines. Adoption basically touches 1 out of every 3 people in your life. So if you personally are not touched by adoption, you may know of someone who's adopted, you may know of someone who is an adoptee. So it's really prevalent. Sometimes people don't always share that information, but just so you know, there's a lot of people who are actually touched by adoption. Currently, 90% of the adopted children who are placed through adoption, especially through foster care and internationally, are abused, neglected, or institutionalized. 80% of children in foster care were exposed prenatally to drugs or alcohol. And adoption is no longer about white babies born of white mothers being adopted by white married couples. And for many people who are not aware of the current demographics and state of adoption, both internationally and through foster care and domestically, they may think that it's about white babies born of white mothers, but it is no longer like that, and we'll talk more about it. And adoption is really about loss. And that's another thing that is a misconception, and that people say, oh, I'm so excited about your adoption, and oh, to the adoptee, you're so lucky. But adoption is really about loss, and we'll also talk about that, how it's not only a loss for the birth parents and for the adoptee, but also there's some losses for the adoptive families, and we'll talk about that. So if you look at children placed in Pennsylvania through international adoption, these are the last 5 years of statistics. So you can see that there are 998 new families placed in Pennsylvania through international adoption. And international adoption has changed tremendously in the last 10 years. Most children now coming to the U.S. from overseas are older children and children with special needs, with a lot of trauma and loss. So it's very similar to the children that are being placed through the foster care system now. If you look at special needs identified adoptions in Pennsylvania, these are the current statistics that are available from 2010 to 2014. You'll see that there are 9,986 new families in the last 5 years. So there are a lot of adoptions being made. Pennsylvania is really doing a really great job with that. There's a lot of focus on doing specific recruitment and preparing families and getting children off the foster care rolls to provide permanency for them. So if you look at those statistics, that's a lot of families in 5 years that are out there that are in need, could be in need of support and therapeutic services. When you're looking at what determines what a special needs child is in the Commonwealth, as we said in this previous slide, those children there are racial or ethnic minorities, members of a sibling group, which are sometimes hard to place, children with some type of medical, physical, or emotional disability, children who have experienced some neglect, abuse, sometimes exposed to drugs in utero, and children over the age of 9 at time of placement. So that which determines that special needs placement that we saw, 9,000 in the last 5 years. So let's talk about those children and some of the experiences that they may be having and their adoptive parents might be experiencing. Sometimes in those challenging behavior we see in our children are manifestations of grief and loss that they have suffered. And this is the big key missing that I think I find as I'm going out to talk to other professionals who are not aware of adoption. And there are a lot of grief and loss issues that are creating anxiety in our kids and sometimes are seen as ADD, ADHD, OCD, those kinds of things, when it's possibly only some grief and loss that needs to be resolved. When you're looking at adoption, there are a lot of losses. We all are familiar with some of them, in terms of birth parents and siblings. Excuse me. But there's also losses of extended family, because even though maybe mom and dad may have been opioid users and maybe grandma was very involved in the life of the child, or an aunt or an uncle. So those losses have occurred. In addition to community, stability, favorite spots, pets, no children can take the pets with them to their foster homes when they're removed. With international adoption, there's country and language and culture, religion, sometimes friends, school. Many of the children in foster care have been placed 5, 6, 7. I placed a child who moved 15 times. So there's a lot of different schools, a lot of different moves, and a lot of different losses. So these are just some of the losses that can occur in a very brief period of time. And really, are there any insignificant losses? So at this point, I generally ask the audience, what do you think the average number of losses for a person age 75 at the end of their life? If we look at that, it's generally 10 to 15 losses. And most of them has occurred when they were an adult, when they were fully educated with a full brain development. If you think about, my first loss was probably at the age of 12. That was my grandfather. But at that time, my brain had a lot of 12 years to develop. My formative years were behind me. In addition, I maybe have read books or saw on TV or saw my mother deal with losses or other family members deal with losses. So I had some contextual basis to be able to process that loss. But sometimes children can have those over 30 losses occur in just minutes at a very young age. And children in foster care and adoption, the only other similar amount of losses would have occurred during a natural disaster or children who were in war, a wartime situation. So it's very, people don't really think of that, but every time a child is moved, they experience at least 10 losses. So when you're looking at loss and grief, grief and loss is an energy. So a good analogy to use with families is to talk about like a swimming pool with a ball. And, when you push down the ball down deep into the water and you're holding it down and you take your hands off quickly, it comes popping up with a huge amount of energy. Similarly with grief and loss that has been unprocessed, when you have a trigger that occurs, be it a birthday, maybe Mother's Day, maybe a smell, a sight, a sound that will be a trigger to something that occurred that would bring up that loss, it will come up like that beach ball with this huge meltdown, this huge amount of energy. So our job is really to help that child process that grief and loss so it's minimalized. I mean, it never goes away, but therefore, when you have that beach ball right below the water surface and you take your hands off of it, it still comes up with energy, but not with such veracity as if it were lower. So it's important for us to help you alleviate the grief and loss with children, and especially if it's pre-verbal loss, they don't really have the words even to make sense out of it. In addition, if it's not processed, it stays in that right side of the brain, that emotional side of the brain. And it needs to be talked about, to be processed, so it moves over to the left side of the brain, which is the intellectual side of the brain. And we'll talk more about that. What you see in terms of developmental mourning behavior with grief and loss for children under the age of 5 can be excessive activity, fearful, no words to process what happened, self-blame. They don't quite understand. No one told them the story. All they saw, mommy and daddy fighting, the police come, and all of a sudden they're being moved out of their home. Was it something they did? Was it, and many times if they haven't processed it, they can be self-blaming. They can do crying, expressions of painful feelings. They can be clingy, have fear of abandonment. If you're looking at developmental mourning in the latency stage, you can see changes in eating and sleeping, hoarding behaviors, distraught, preoccupied, school problems. It's really hard for children to focus on learning when they're basically focusing all of their energy on grief and loss and concern and worry. They can have anger issues. Many times, unprocessed grief and loss can result in a need for anger management. They can be withdrawn, passive, unwilling to connect, or even have control issues. And when you look at adolescents, and many times we see this when we come out to homes of teens with our post-adoption support, is a lot of risk-taking going on, self-destruction, suicidal thoughts, running away, drugs and alcohol, and depression. So it's real important to process that grief and loss with life books, for children to be able to understand where they've been, putting those pictures together, making that sense out of that story of why they were removed, what was going on with mommy and daddy. They can do that through loss and lifelines, so they can talk about, what happened at different points of their life to be able to understand a little bit more. The number one fear of children who are age 13 and younger is the loss of parents. This was the number one fear that kids have, and it happened to them. And children learn best through storytelling. So let's move on to brain research. I've been doing adoption work for some 15 years. I'm an adoptive mom. My daughter's 26. And in the early days of adoption, there wasn't a lot of hope for families. When they knew children had been from trauma and from abuse and neglect, the thought process was you really couldn't do much. The brain was static. It was done. It was what it was. However, new research has indicated that there's a plasticity in the brain and that we have the ability to create new connections and to help children move through that trauma to be able to start to trust and attach and connect. So when a child is born, the brain is a phenomenal, part of the body. And we don't know a lot about it still. We just know pieces, but it's designed to work in concert with other brains. The brain is what allows us to create relationship. It's designed for trust, and it's a historical organ. So it basically stores our experiences. So it's storing and has stored those experiences of children who have had trauma, neglect, grief, and loss. This is a wonderful model of the brain. I encourage you to use this with families. We can take a quick video here. Hopefully it works. There we go. This is Dan Siegel.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up, representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull, the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child. And that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
So that's a wonderfully empowering gift that you can give to parents and children. When I go into a home, the first thing I do is I go over this very similar PowerPoint presentation. So I explain to parents, and if teenagers, then I explain to teens exactly, what the hand model of the brain is, what trauma is, how it affects them, and it really empowers them to be able to understand, because it's very scary. Kids don't like being in this situation. It's very empowering to both the parent as well as the child to be able to help them understand. So when you're looking at the hand model of the brain, the wrist part is the brain stem, which basically controls our breathing, our heart rate, our pulse, our sweating. Basically it's the reptilian brain. It's developed in utero. So depending upon if mom was using drugs or alcohol, or even if mom was under a lot of stress from from the outside world, that impacts the baby as it grows, and it impacts the brain as it develops. The limbic system, the little thumb area, which is our hippocampus and our amygdala, basically was partially developed in utero. So that also can be affected, and that's our fight, flight, or freeze period, a spot. It basically is our emotional generator. It communicates to the lizard brain. I'm scared, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm sad. and it causes the body to then fight, flight, or freeze. And that piece also generates memory. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, doesn't fully develop until age 26. Develops a little earlier for girls, a little later for boys. And that develops through secure attachment relationship. It also is our regulation and control area, and regulation is a big piece we'll be talking about later. So you want to make connections from your alarm system, that amygdala, the limbic area, to the prefrontal cortex to be able to help the child be able to regulate, and that's done through secure attachment. So basically our brain makes connections from the minute we're born. Experience creates connection. If it fires, it wires. So whatever a child experienced as they were growing up from birth creates these connections. And the more that the connection occurs, the stronger that memory muscle gets. So I'm going to do a little exercise. I'm going to say 2 sets of words. First set of words, Eiffel Tower. Now, generally, I ask my audience at this point, did that create anything for them? And what I usually hear is a mental picture of the Eiffel Tower comes up. Now, how does that happen when I just say 2 words? Free of it because we have that memory muscle. Maybe you actually traveled to Paris for a honeymoon and it's a very wonderful experience. Maybe you read about it in a book. Maybe you saw a movie about it. Or maybe you were 9 years old and you were at the Eiffel Tower and you got separated from your mom and dad, and it was a very scary experience. So some other things are going to be coming up from that muscle memory. Okay, let me move on to the second set of words. Estrat Mallorca. In many cases, the audience would say, doesn't make connections that makes it fire and wire. Unless you've been to the island of Mallorca, that's one of the best beaches to go to. Estrenc. So as I said, if you don't have those experiences, then you don't have any connection or any memory. Another important part that we've learned about the brain is our mirror neurons. And this is also tremendously empowering to parents. They were discovered by accident in the 1990s. There was researchers they had the monkey brains connected to electrodes. And they gave the monkey a peanut. The monkey ate the peanut, and the researcher said, okay, monkey eats peanut, and this part of the brain lights up. They replicated that. They continued that several times. They wanted to verify that that was the brain, and it happened the same way on different monkeys, and it didn't matter if the monkey was male or female, blah, blah, blah. And at one point, the researcher was hungry, and the researcher ate a peanut. And the exact same part of the brain that lit up when the monkey ate the peanut also lit up when they saw the researcher eat a peanut. So these mirror neurons really give you an insight into knowing about them, that you can have the ability to have an impact on other people's brains and other people's amygdala and other people's calmness and other people's excitedness. Sometimes they say when someone walks into the room, they light up the room. Or if you walk into the room where everyone's sad, sometimes that can bring you down. But being aware of neurons will help families to practice being mindful so that they know that they have that ability. And we'll talk a little bit more about de-escalation of a child who's having a meltdown and flipping his lid. That they have the ability to calm the other child, the child who's having a meltdown, or the person who's having a meltdown. Because a calm amygdala trumps an active amygdala every time. So when a child sees a dog bark, and they see Spot bark, and they hear it, and they see Spot, and let's say a week later, Spot's not in the room and he barks, the child will know that that bark is from Spot. And eventually, if there's enough times that they hear Spot bark, they'll be able to identify which bark is Spot's and which bark is their neighbor's bark. So this is an example of actually seeing a connection occur.
You see things, it'll cause a whole pattern of visual activation. This is what happens when you hear the dog bark. And so vision, hearing, and in the primary sensory association area, you'll make a connection, right?
So that's the connection there. That was a first-time connection. But as I said, as more and more times the dog barks, that develops a stronger muscle mass and a strong memory mass. So early experiences are stored in the child's brain as their first social memories. They can be triggered by facial expression, tone of voice, movement. Sometimes children who come from abusive homes and they're in the classroom and the person sitting next to them raises their hand, they may cower because to them, when someone raises their hand, that means they're going to get hit. So it can be even a smell can actually trigger a memory. And 90% of a child's brain develops through experiences in those first 4 years of life. There's a lot of connections being made at that time. So let's take a look at Andy and Billy. So Andy had a very nurturing environment, gentle physical touch. His parents were emotionally available. They met his needs regularly. They were consistent. There was a lot of stability in the home. It was safe and calm in utero experience. Billy, on the other hand, experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. He was in foster care. He was then adopted. Prior to placement, he had a poor diet, frequent moves. Andy, on the other hand, had an easy birth, had sensitive caretakers, responsible parents, his needs were met, a very safe and secure environment, which was predictable, and good health. Billy had accidents, birth trauma, had depressed parents, unmet needs. He was bullied in school, and many of our kids are bullied. They tend to be seen as victims. There was domestic violence and also medical trauma. So let's say, seated next to us, we have Andy and Billy. They're going to look a whole lot different, even though they're still the age 10. They both grew up in Pennsylvania. They, based upon those experiences, that muscle memory that they have, Andy will be a little bit more relaxed, more open, whereas Billy can be hypervigilant, can be anxious, can be just kind of scanning his environment to determine what he needs to do to be able to survive. So the lack of social relationship foundation that other people take for granted is very different for Billy and then Andy. And if you're looking at their stress tolerance, Andy, who had the very calm, predictable environment, it's a large area before he will flip his lid. Whereas Billy, very small area. So it could just take a minor incident, minor stress that can cause him to flip his lid because his amygdala is, once again, scanning the environment for a threat. This is just the final piece of that. It's Dr. Bruce Perry. I'm going to scooch forward on it because it's a lengthy video. I just want to get the last piece, but I encourage you to see this whole series from the Child Trauma Academy.
At a time stress that lead either to a system that is
Whoops. What happened?
Welcome everybody, this is Dr. Bruce Perry and this is
Sorry.
it's very repetitive and provide where the system is so much about the stress response, know that that's exactly what happens when you look at the patterns of stress that lead either to a system that is resilient and capable of tolerating significant stressors, or a system that has been stressed in an unpredictable, severe, and prolonged way.
So that's Billy on the left.
Pattern of activation is toxic and leads to a whole range of functional compromise in the body and in a variety of brain-mediated functions. The other pattern results in a flexible stress response capability, making the individual more capable of dealing with stressors. Now, the interesting thing is, those of you who are tracking with this will know that one of the most important observations about trauma-related alterations in function is the development of a vulnerability that arises from a sensitized stress response system. And we'll talk in future sessions about which components of the stress response can become sensitized and what that looks like clinically. But in this case, what I want you to remember is that if you are lucky enough to have a normal stress response reactivity, and you are in an environment where there's a baseline level of arousal, you will have a linear response such that you'll be in an active alert state. And if you are exposed to a little bit of stressor, you can get into a low-level alarm state. You can get into the fear state. And of course, you can go up and down this curve depending upon the circumstances of the day or the week and so forth. So you and I, who have normal linear relationship between internal response and external challenge, external threat, external stress, will be on this line. Individuals who've had a sensitizing pattern of stress activation, in other words, kids that grow up in chaos, who grow up in unpredictable, threatening environments, who are exposed to a variety of either natural disasters or man-made disasters, and individuals who are victimized by abuse and neglect end up on this curve. And what that means is, even at baseline, in the absence of any external threat, their brain says that they are under attack. And what that means is they will think differently, they'll function differently, and they will behave differently. This, of course, underlies many of the observations of educators, caregivers, mental health professionals who work with children and adults who've been exposed to trauma. We'll talk more about this in a future series. Thank you for...
So I encourage you to view that series. It's very good with Dr. Perry. You just Google it. So basically, kids who have had a lot of trauma are wired for distrust, and they're scanning constantly for danger. So why is attachment so important? Well, basically, attachment teaches us to trust and to regulate. And remember what we talked about before with the brain. Attachment helps that prefrontal cortex to make that connection, to be able to regulate and help to calm that amygdala so that it determines whether it really is something to be afraid of, or maybe not, to put the brakes on that. So it kind of helps us to regulate. So if you're looking at developing a good secure base with attachment, you have a child who needs their diaper changed, and the caregiver responds, child feels better, and then they go back to the normal state. Then maybe the child is hungry, cries, caregiver comes, feeds the child, and they go back to the normal state. Maybe the child is afraid or lonely, caregiver picks them up, they hold them, each time there's that comfort from the caregiver, the brain is bathed in these good chemicals that make them feel very good to help them move to the normal state. So this goes on. hundreds and thousands of times in that first 4 years when those brains are developed by those children. So if it's good attachment and there's a responsible caregiver, then you have a secure base and the child learns to trust adults. On the other hand, where you have difficult attachment or no attachment, or where there's abuse and neglect involved, the child will have need their diaper changed, they'll be hungry, and the caregiver doesn't respond. The child learns, I don't need you. They learn to self-comfort. An insecure base is developed. Adults aren't so great, have a mistrust, and they learn to be all right without enjoying other people. They learn to be self-reliant. They can shift their pleasure systems from people to objects. So these are things that need to be reconditioned with, new muscle mass needs to be developed with the adoptive family so that the child moves into this secure base where they can trust adults versus that insecure base. Children with blocked trust, they have to make adjustments to their comfort and pain systems. They learn not to need comforting. They soothe themselves. They are hypervigilant. They can quickly befriend strangers to make sure they're nice to them. They can be sneaky and manipulative. They can practice sweat-free lying. They self-provide. They hide their inner life to avoid being hurt. They titrate closeness just enough for protection from danger. And they can compete with siblings and peers to make sure their needs are met. Because in their world, resources were scarce, and they learned how to survive. So two very important key terms are regulation and dysregulation. Once again, regulation is developed through attachment. You co-regulate with mom, or dad. They pick you up, they hold you, they help to calm you down. They're teaching you how to calm yourself, how to regulate, putting that prefrontal cortex, starting to develop that prefrontal cortex. Whereas with dysregulation, that's the experience of stress outside of one's window of tolerance. And it's believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. So if we could all get good attachment in every home in the US, we would have a lot less psychiatric disorders going on. So the brain is basically the boss of all behavior. A regulated brain will produce regulated behaviors, and a dysregulated brain will produce unregulated behaviors 100% of the time. And regulation is all about developing that attachment, that patterned, rhythmic, repetitive experiences with a loving and regulated caretaker to calm the brain, helping the child learn how to regulate, learn how to calm down, because they never got that training, that experience, that co-regulation when they were young. So in terms of dealing, with trauma, the important question that professionals as well as, parents should be asking is, what is driving this child's behavior? Not how do I get this child to change his behavior? And that's part of the issue with some therapies. The medical profession as well as some therapeutic profession, is around behavior modification. And behavior modification will change the one behavior, but if you don't know what's driving the child's behavior, something else is going to pop up. Another question is, what can I do at this very moment to improve my relationship with this child? Because if this child's lid is flipped, they don't have access to that prefrontal cortex, that access to that regulation. They are just in that very scary, unsafe mode, and you need to basically develop a relationship to help that child calm down. The number one task of adoptive parents is basically to create safety, to help this child recover from distress, to help the child feel safe. And when they flip their lid, they're basically offline, and they really can't gain any new knowledge. Fearful children can't learn. Some unique physical needs. Glutamate is commonly elevated in children with histories of harm. So it's important they can get dehydrated easily, that you have water there for children every 2 hours. When I'm talking to teachers, I indicate they need to have these kids bring in their water bottles. Insulin receptors are altered by chronic stress and prenatal exposure to alcohol, resulting in variations in blood sugar levels. Every 2 hours, a snack, something healthy, nuts, fruit. They need to keep their blood sugar levels at the right level. And a majority of children with history of harms are reactive to sensory input. The number 2 task of parents is to become a sensory detective. I encourage families to journal. They want to be able to determine what's the triggers for their child. It can be a sight, a smell, a sound, a touch. Is it happening in the morning? Is it happening on the way to school? Is it happening before bedtime? Is it happening at bath time? What are the triggers? As long as you're doing the water and the food, and they've got good sleep, those are important things too, then what else is going on that's providing that trigger? Because it'll help you better to address, to be preventative in terms of stopping a meltdown. And the third task is connect before you correct. It's important to build that relationship. When the child's flipped their lid, they're offline. The relationship is the most important thing, rather than lecturing them or telling them this is, you did the wrong thing, you need to go to apologize. Language is not accessible when the child is in a heightened state of fear. And it's important for us to understand that stress keeps us out of relationship with one another. So the emotional and psychological reaction to a threat, whether it's real or imagined, results in a series of adaptations by our bodies, and it keeps us out of relationship. Parents also need to internalize that all behaviors arise from a state of stress. That amygdala is just there throbbing and like scanning the environment. And that negative behaviors arise from an unconscious state. Negative behaviors do not stem from conscious intent, and scared children do scary things. And the third principle is for parents to not personalize, and that there's a negative and positive repetitious conditioning. So if you're doing X and then they do Y, how to fix it is to do something different. You need to try other modalities. You can't prevent a child from getting angry, but you can maintain the relationship. Traditional techniques and models don't work on children affected by trauma. The focus should be on stress modification, not behavior modification. Sticker charts are fear-based. So if the child doesn't feel okay about themselves, they're overwhelmed, they won't try it. You also need to get the child from that bottom, that lizard brain, which is the emotional brain, to the top. Rather, sticker charts go from the top down. Timeout is not good because the child can't regulate. You need to have the child sit with you with the timeout to help teach them to regulate. As I said earlier, ADHD, bipolar, ODD, and conduct disorders are the most incorrectly diagnosed disorders that we have out there. And behavior modification is wrapped in changing the behavior rather than identifying what's driving the behavior. So if we're looking at how to de-escalate, it's important that you don't add to the stress. For parents to really concentrate and focus on that mindfulness of being calm, keeping a calm amygdala trumps active amygdala every time. You're taking deep breaths, focusing on connection, not control. Communicate at the level where that child's brain is at. They're flipping out and having a meltdown. You're not talking to the prefrontal cortex. You're talking to that scared child, the amygdala, hippocampus, and the lizard brain. And let the child talk. Give them a glass of water. When the situation has calmed down, then you can collaborate and talk about, what went wrong. Some calming techniques for the overstimulated child. Deep pressure is really helpful. That can be hugs, having them carry a heavy backpack, have them carry bean bags, pressure like weighted blankets, hands on their shoulder if they don't want you to hug them. Deep massage is important. If they don't allow you to give them deep massage, then a hand massage or a foot massage. Hot baths, warm water in the sink, heavy work, pushing clothes in a basket, crawling, pounding, Play-Doh, drums. Low lights, quiet places, calm, reassuring voices. Running wears off stress. Slow and low. Always have the parents to be conscious of slowing down, lowering their demands, lowering their voice, trying to calm that amygdala. Joint compressions, have the child stretch their limbs, their body. That helps to calm. Regulatory patterns, when you see a mother with a baby, you'll see her swaying and rocking and bouncing. Those are all rhythmic regulatory patterns, helping to soothe the child, helping them to calm down. And you can do that no matter how old the child is. Having the child have a safe area to escape, and then always relaxation techniques. There's a deep breathing, muscle tension and relaxation. There's a lot of yoga or some way to focus on calming the mind. I always, indicate that, I ask the question of a therapist, do you do individual therapy or do you do family therapy? It's so important when you're working with adoptive families that you do family therapy, and that many times parents need to check their baggage too. And they need to be involved not only in learning all about trauma and how to, work together at helping the child calm down, helping the child regulate, having the child understand about that, but also for them to take a look at their own baggage. Because sometimes when a parent feels that their buttons are being pushed, it may be something that had happened to them, something that's going on with them. When you're looking at the core issues in adoption, according to Greg Keck, he feels strongly that when a parent and a child are having a disagreement and buttons are being pushed, that they are experiencing issues around the core issues of adoption, of grief or identity or intimacy and relationship and control. Because these issues, as I said at the beginning, they affect all parts of the triune. Loss certainly affects the birth parents because they lose the child to whom they're genetically connected. It affects the adoptees because they've suffered that initial separation from their birth family. But it also affects the adoptive parent because every little girl or little boy grows up with this vision and dream of what their family is going to be like and what their kids are going to be like and what their family is going to be like. And when you have a child with a lot of trauma, that vision and those expectations can be totally not on the same plane. So there's that loss of that dream that adoptive families have. Similarly with rejection, adoptees view their placement into adoption as rejection. Why did my parents abandon me? Birth parents frequently condemn themselves for being responsible, as does society, in terms of their decision. And then adoptive parents, especially if they've experienced infertility, may also feel that rejection, that their body rejected them, or even God rejected them. What did they do? What did they do when they were younger that God won't allow them to have children? So all of these particular issues can affect all three parts, and discussing that and helping, because even though the adoptive family may have said they've resolved those issues, they may need to kind of take another look. And as I said, check their baggage. So issues that surface within caregivers when dealing with traumatized children. If you put a frog into boiling water, it leaps out and escapes. However, if you put a frog in cool, pleasant water and you turn up the temperature, the frog will die. So similarly, you have a loving and potentially unprepared adoptive foster family. You have a child with special needs, trauma, and survival strategies. You have a cool and pleasant home. And you have an emotional thermostat that no one's paying attention to. So families need to understand that they need to pay attention to that thermostat. And adoption is a lifelong journey. So you may think that the thermostat is fine, and then 13, 14, 15 occurs, and no one's paying attention to the thermostat. And once again, you start to get into that boil occurs, and it's not a gradual boil. So families come in saying, oh, I really enjoy parenting this child, and then it's a little bit more than I expected, but I'm doing okay. Then I'm getting overwhelmed and angry and frustrated, and then I can't do this anymore. And that's when they tend to reach out for help, when they're as well as the child. Some common parental expectations that generally are not, can create conflict with adoptive parents is that love will be enough, that we will feel love and connection to this child quickly, and in many cases that's not the case. The child will step into the family system and then easily learn how to function within the rules and goals and ambitions of the family. This child needs will be just like those of biological children. I hear that all the time. Oh, I raised four successful children, and so I feel I will be able to be an adoptive parent. Our child will fit well in our extended family and be welcomed by them, as well as number 6, my friends and acquaintances will validate my role. You know, if children have experienced sexual abuse or physical abuse, you could go over to visit, you know, Auntie Jane and her kids, and the child may be exhibiting aggression or maybe even sexualized behavior. And then you're going to hear from friends and family, oh, this is just an adult gathering. So you might not have that validation from your parents and friends. And that's probably the biggest aha moment for pre-adoptive families to learn, but many don't have this training. Our child will see us as his family and forget about his birth family. That's not going to happen. And 8 and 9, I can do for this child what was not done for me, or I will not do to this child what was done for me. And you know, when we flip our lids, we tend to revert to those experiences that we've learned and we experienced in our childhood. And I will never feel any regrets or ambivalence in adopting this child with a traumatic past. And many times the families do. So you have something believed, you have the expectations developed, you have the failure of the expectation, and then you have the family that's disappointed, discouraged, despair, depression, and they're ready to disrupt. So the other piece, one other thing I want to talk about this, the number one type family that disrupts is those that have mom who is college educated. And that surprises a lot of people. So it's important for when we do screening for adoptive families that we have those conversations with those successful moms, because many times they have had, done really well in school, went to college, done really well in college, came out of college, successfully got a job. So it's important to have that conversation is, have you ever had a failure? Have you ever failed in life? Because many times they'll get to a point where they will feel like they're failing in being a parent, but it can't be them because they've had all these successes and they don't know how to quite deal with failure, so it must be the child. So something that parents need to be aware of, and you and therapists also, is that the secondary trauma is very common. When you're trying to do your best for the child and trying to deal with the trauma and trying to deal with the issues, that stress resulting from wanting to help a traumatized child or suffering person can cause secondary trauma for the adoptive parents. And who's at risk? people who are empathetic, who have no recovery time, nobody to help them out, provide respite for them. Parents who have their own history of trauma and possibly haven't talked that through or worked that through. Those who feel isolated, who don't have that support system, no resources or support, and once again, that perception of failure. So it's so important for people to look at a self-care plan, to talk about a self-care plan, so that they have that time for recovery, so that they can go to a support group. And that's one of the benefits of that post-perm services that are offered through Pennsylvania, is they have the support group, that people can go to and talk to other people who have children placed like them. Because talking to a mom who is a mom of Andy, who has had that predictable, quiet environment, and then you having Billy, your experiences, you're trying to get empathy and connection with her. She's not going to have any clue what, or be able to really provide solace and comfort, because she's just not there with you. But talking to other families who've experienced those same situations can be very helpful. So the non-essential skills of trauma-informed assessment and support is understanding the trauma's impact. And this is about doing that psychosocial education with the family and the child, if they're old enough, to help them understand, what the impact of trauma is, so that they understand what's going on in their little brains and why they're acting, why their amygdala is flipping their lids, and also for parents to understand and felt safety, for parents to help children to manage their emotions and their behavior, helping them to learn ways to calm, helping them to regulate, helping them to make an attachment so that they can get that prefrontal cortex back online. Support relationships, helping children to understand their life story through life books, through the lifeline, different ways for them to understand where they have been, making sense from that emotional brain and tying it to the intellectual brain through story, through understanding, so that they know what their life story is and not what they made up. Advocate for services. It's important to support trauma-informed treatment, especially in therapy, and that they have a personal self-care plan. Threw a couple slides in about building resilience, because if kids are resilient, you can place two siblings and one will do really well and the other won't. It depends. It's important for building resiliency that children learn empathy. And the internet's wonderful. You can Google empathy exercises that you can do. I encourage this in the classrooms when I talk to teachers, because developing empathy really help build resiliency. Identifying the physical and emotional responses, facilitating success, even little successes each week, actively listening, instilling optimism, accepting children for who they are, providing children opportunities to contribute. I also strongly encourage community service activities for the family to get involved and to help others. That's the key from all the new books out to happiness, is through helping others. So that helps them build that resiliency and helping them deal with their mistakes. So when we're looking at the post-perm services that's offered through the for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, what's the possibility is, if you're working with any adoptive families, they can get 6 months of case management where a professional will come into the home, kind of assess what's going on. Do they need help with their IEPs in the school? Do they need a therapist? Do they need to get that psychosocial education about trauma? Do they need to learn how to develop some attachment and regulation? There's also support groups. So there are opportunities for them to connect with other families who are having those same experiences, so that they can have someone to learn alongside with them and share experiences and share helpful hints that worked. And then there's respite, which is really unique and wonderful, and that it's not traditional respite all the time. It can be also respite activities that can build self-esteem in children, or can help them with their social skills. Activities that give mom and dad a break, but also the services would pay for activities for the child to be able to focus on some particular identified goal that they have with the family. So families are interested in being a part of getting the post-adoption support services. They can call the Swan Helpline. There's a number there, and also the email address if they want to request post-perm services.